peace and grace of Christ to all. Were the wars of early Islam about spreading faith, or were they invasions aimed at political dominance? In today's video, we're going to explore the real motivations behind Islamic wars. Were they conquests for the cause of Islam, or invasions driven by expansionist ambitions? Let's uncover the truth behind history. If you find this topic valuable, we invite you to subscribe to the Church in Morocco channel, like this video, and share it with others who could benefit from it. The historical background of early Islamic wars. After Muhammad's death in 632 AD, Islamic forces rapidly expanded beyond the Arabian Peninsula. Within just a few decades, they had conquered vast territories, including parts of the Byzantine and Persian empires. This period of expansion is often portrayed as a righteous mission to spread Islam, but was that really the whole story? Let's examine the facts more closely. The regions that Islamic armies targeted were not just random stretches of land. They were wealthy, influential, and strategically important areas. The Byzantine Empire, for instance, controlled major trade routes and fertile lands. The Persian Empire, on the other hand, was a powerful civilization rich in resources. These were not just territories for spreading faith, they were lands of political and economic significance. We must ask, if the goal was purely religious, why did Islamic forces prioritize these wealthy and powerful regions over others? Would it not make sense to first spread Islam among the poor or isolated peoples who might be more open to accepting a new faith? The focus on influential empires raises questions about the true motivations behind these campaigns. The concept of jihad was frequently invoked during these early wars. The word jihad in Arabic means struggle, and in many Islamic teachings, it can refer to both an internal, spiritual struggle and an external, physical one. However, in the context of these wars, jihad was often framed as a justification for military conquest. This raises a crucial question. Was this struggle really about spreading faith, or was it a cover for more worldly ambitions like power and wealth? In some cases, local populations were allowed to keep their religion if they paid a tax, jizya, which further complicates the narrative. If the primary goal was religious, why allow people to continue practicing their own faith for a fee? This system suggests that political control and financial gain were also significant factors in these campaigns. The jizya wasn't just a religious imposition. It was a form of economic subjugation that reinforced the dominance of Islamic rulers over non-Muslim subjects to pay or get killed. These early Islamic campaigns appear to have been about more than just faith. They strategically targeted regions of great wealth and influence, and while religion was part of the justification, the pattern of conquest suggests that political power and economic control were equally, if not more important. By focusing on these prosperous areas, the Islamic Empire grew not only in faith, but also in riches and territory. In light of this evidence, we must reconsider the common portrayal of these wars as purely religious. The use of jihad as a justification for military expansion and the focus on wealthy regions suggest that the Islamic conquests were driven by a combination of religious and worldly ambitions. This blending of faith and politics is key to understanding the true nature of early Islamic wars. Were these conquests or invasions? To truly understand the nature of early Islamic wars, we need to ask an essential question. What's the difference between a conquest and an invasion? A conquest is often framed as a righteous or justified act. It's portrayed as a mission to liberate oppressed people or to spread a higher cause. In this sense, conquest can be seen as a noble effort where the victors bring about positive change, stability, or even religious enlightenment. Conquest implies not only the taking of land, but also the promise of something better for the conquered. An invasion, however, carries a much different meaning. An invasion involves forceful entry, domination, and often the destruction of local culture and autonomy. It is rarely seen as an act of liberation. Instead, it implies subjugation, taking control for the benefit of the invader rather than the people living there. In an invasion, the interests of the conquerors are the priority, while the local population is left to suffer under foreign rule. Now, let's apply this understanding to early Islamic wars, starting with Persia. When Islamic forces entered Persia in the 7th century, they did not come as liberators. Persia, with its rich culture, sophisticated social structures, and Zoroastrian faith, had long been a powerful empire. Yet, after the Islamic invasion, Persian traditions and religious practices were suppressed. The Persian population was forced to pay the jizya if they wished to keep their faith and their life, and over time, Islamic rule dominated every aspect of life. The question we must ask is, was Persia liberated, or was it subjugated by force? The same can be said for Syria. Prior to the arrival of Islamic forces, Syria was part of the Byzantine Empire, with a diverse population that included Christians, Jews, and pagans. When Islamic armies entered, they encountered little resistance, as the Byzantine Empire was weakened. However, after taking control, Islamic rulers imposed new laws, collected heavy taxes from non-Muslims, and gradually marginalized the existing cultures and religions. While some Islamic sources refer to this as a peaceful conquest, the historical reality points to an invasion where domination, not liberation, was the end goal. Egypt follows a similar pattern. A rich and ancient land, Egypt had been under Byzantine rule for centuries. When Islamic forces arrived, the initial entry was relatively smooth, as the Coptic Christian population had strained relations with Byzantine rulers. However, this doesn't mean that Egypt was liberated in the true sense. Once Islamic control was established, Egyptian culture and religious practices were systematically suppressed. Non-Muslims were heavily taxed, and over time, Islam became the dominant force in both political and cultural life. Was this a conquest, bringing freedom to the people, or an invasion that brought cultural erasure and domination? In all these examples, Persia, Syria, and Egypt, we see clear evidence of force, subjugation, and cultural erasure. Islamic sources may describe these actions as conquests, emphasizing the spread of Islam, but the historical record tells a different story. Rather than peaceful transitions, these regions experienced invasions that changed the course of their histories forever. The local cultures, religions, and societies were either suppressed or radically transformed to fit the new Islamic order. So, were these lands truly liberated, or were they overrun by force? Based on the evidence, it's hard to argue that these regions were freed in any meaningful way. The people were not given more freedom. They were subjected to new rulers and new religious laws. In many cases, their cultures were systematically erased or marginalized. The historical record suggests that these early Islamic expansions were invasions, not conquests. The use of force, the imposition of jizya on non-Muslims, and the suppression of local cultures are all hallmarks of invasion rather than liberation. Why did these wars happen? Religion or power? This section is critical. What truly motivated the early Islamic wars? Many argue that these wars were primarily religious, waged to spread Islam to new lands and convert people to the faith. At first glance, this explanation seems convincing, especially given how closely the concept of jihad, struggle for the faith, is tied to Islamic military efforts. But if we dig deeper into historical records and the circumstances surrounding these wars, a different picture emerges, one that points more toward political ambition, territorial expansion, and the pursuit of wealth and power. Let's start by looking at the scale and scope of these early wars. After the death of Muhammad, the Islamic Caliphate did not limit its military efforts to nearby regions or those that shared common cultural or religious traits. Instead, Islamic armies marched into some of the richest and most powerful empires of the time, including the Byzantine and Persian empires. These weren't small, isolated communities waiting to hear the message of Islam. They were wealthy, well-established civilizations with vast territories, trade routes, and resources. Slaves, especially women slaves, was a big income for Muslims. So, why target these lands? If the primary goal was religious, why not focus on converting smaller, less powerful groups first? It seems unlikely that these massive military campaigns were solely about spreading faith. The lands that were targeted were not just fertile ground for new religious converts. They were critical hubs of political power and economic wealth. Persia, for example, was not just a pagan empire ripe for conversion. It was a wealthy and advanced society with an abundance of resources, trade connections, and strategic importance. When we look at the actions of the caliphs, the political and religious leaders who succeeded Muhammad, we see that many of their decisions were focused on expanding their empire's influence and wealth. Under the early caliphs, the Islamic empire expanded at a breathtaking pace, conquering vast territories that spanned from North Africa to Central Asia. This rapid expansion wasn't just about spreading Islam. It was about securing control over valuable resources, trade routes, and strategic locations. The lands they conquered brought them great wealth in the form of taxation, tribute, and control over vital trade networks. In fact, many regions that were conquered during this period were not immediately or forcefully converted to Islam. Instead, the jizya special imposed on non-Muslims was used as a means of generating revenue for the Islamic State. If spreading the faith had been the sole motivation, why allow people to remain non-Muslim in exchange for money to stay alive? This system suggests that financial gain was a significant factor in these campaigns. The conquered peoples were not always required to convert to Islam, but they were required to submit to Islamic rule and contribute economically to the expansion of the empire. This raises another important question. Would these wars have happened without the promise of wealth and power? If there had been no potential for economic gain, no strategic advantage to be won, and no empire to build, would Islamic leaders still have waged these wars? The evidence suggests otherwise. While religious motives undoubtedly played a role, it is clear that the wars were driven by more than just faith. The promise of land, wealth, and political dominance was too great to ignore. Conquering wealthy empires like Persia and Byzantium not only expanded the reach of Islam, but also significantly increased the power and influence of the caliphs. Political ambition was a major driving force behind these wars. As the Islamic empire grew, so did the power of its leaders. The early caliphs sought to establish themselves as rulers not just of a religious community, but of a vast, interconnected empire. To achieve this, they needed land, wealth, and control over key regions. The wars of expansion allowed them to secure all three. Religion may have been the banner under which they fought, but the pursuit of political and economic power was the engine that drove these campaigns forward. Many historical records suggest that these wars were motivated as much if not more by political ambition as they were by a desire to spread the Islamic faith. The fact that conquered peoples were allowed to retain their religion in exchange to pay for their lives, and that wealthy and powerful regions were prioritized over poorer, less significant ones, points to a complex mixture of motives. It wasn't just about faith. It was about building an empire, consolidating power, and securing the vast resources needed to maintain and expand Islamic rule. In conclusion, while religious motives certainly played a part, we need to face the reality that the early Islamic wars were not purely driven by the desire to spread Islam. They were wars of expansion, motivated by political ambition and the pursuit of wealth and power. The promise of land, resources, and political influence shaped the course of these wars just as much, if not more, than the goal of religious conversion. What happened after these wars? Now, let's look at the aftermath of these wars. Once the battles ended, and the Islamic forces took control of new territories, the real changes began. The people living in these conquered lands were not simply left to live, as they always had. Instead, they were subjected to a range of new rules and obligations under Islamic law. The most notable of these was the jizya, imposed on non-Muslims. The jizya was presented as a form of protection money. Non-Muslims were allowed to stay alive, but in exchange they had to pay the money. Islamic rulers claimed that by paying the jizya, these non-Muslims would receive protection from harm and would be allowed to live under Islamic rule without being forced to convert. But the reality of the situation was much more complex. Was this truly a system of protection, or was it a form of forced submission? For many of the conquered people, the jizya was not just a tax. It was a clear reminder that they were now second-class citizens. They were allowed to practice their faith, but only as long as they paid for that freedom. And even then, their lives were heavily restricted under Islamic rule. Non-Muslims faced social and political limitations, and their ability to hold positions of influence or power was significantly diminished. The tax was a burden that marked them as different, as subjugated. Beyond the financial toll, conquered populations were often pressured to adopt Islamic customs and practices. While conversion to Islam wasn't always immediate over time, many non-Muslims found it easier to convert rather than continue paying the jizya and living as second-class citizens, and they were women can be raped by Muslims. Islamic rule gradually reshaped the culture, law, and social structures of these regions. What had once been diverse societies with a variety of religious and cultural practices became dominated by Islamic customs and traditions. Let's take the example of Persia again. Once a proud empire with a rich history and unique cultural identity, Persia's Zoroastrian religion and traditions were slowly pushed aside under Islamic rule. Over time, Islamic customs replaced many of Persia's native practices, and the region became increasingly Islamicized. The same pattern can be seen in other conquered regions like Syria and Egypt, where Christianity and local traditions were gradually overshadowed by Islamic law and practices. Politically, the consequences of these wars were profound. Local rulers were replaced by Islamic governors, and the conquered regions were integrated into the broader Islamic empire. This wasn't just a military occupation, it was a complete transformation of society. Islamic rulers imposed their legal and political systems, which further solidified their control over the conquered lands. The idea of liberation that some Islamic sources suggest doesn't align with the historical record. These regions were not liberated from oppression, they were subjugated and reshaped to fit the expanding Islamic empire. The cultural and political changes that followed these wars highlight the reality. These were not conquests meant to free people from tyranny or spread a message of religious enlightenment. Instead, they were invasions that brought about a significant shift in power and control. The original cultures and religions of the conquered peoples were either marginalized or slowly erased, while Islamic rule and customs became dominant. In the end, the aftermath of these wars tells a clear story. The people in these regions were not protected in the way that Islamic rulers claimed. They were taxed, restricted, and forced to live under a new set of laws that prioritized the conqueror's interests over the well-being of the local population. This was not liberation, it was domination. The wars may have ended, but the impact of Islamic rule continued to reshape these societies for centuries to come. What does the historical evidence show? The early Islamic wars weren't just about faith. They were about power, land, and political control. The question we started with remains important. Were these conquests or invasions? The evidence strongly suggests they were invasions. If we want to understand the truth about Islamic wars, we must be honest with history. The facts are clear. These wars were about more than spreading faith. If you find this topic valuable, we invite you to subscribe to the Church in Morocco channel, like this video, and share it with others who could benefit from it. God bless you all.